Pokemon might be the coziest franchise in the world, but under all the bright colors and happy battle music, the games are quietly built on broken maps, dead data, and little horror stories the code is still telling in the background. You remember warm nights grinding EXP and listening to that Route 1 theme. The cartridges remember glitch corridors, unused trainers, and ghost entries in the Pokédex that read like someone slipped a creepypasta into a children's game. I want to talk about those tonight because what's interesting about this series is that for something so carefully branded as comforting, the actual worlds the games created are full of cut areas, void spaces, and half-finished ideas that still exist, just out of bounds. And we're going to walk through them slowly, like a bedtime story about a universe made of leftover code. This is meant to be calm, something you can drift off to, even as the details get progressively weirder and more unsettling the deeper we go. So here's the hook that still feels unreal to me. Inside Pokemon Gold and Silver, there is basically a compressed corpse of Pokemon Red's Kanto. The post-game region you stroll through, with its oddly short routes and missing dungeons, is literally built over shrunken, repurposed data from the original games. You're not just revisiting Kanto for old time's sake. The cartridge is quietly letting you walk across the scaled-down remains of a previous world one last time. How cozy does that feel now? It's worth mentioning that this isn't some one-off quirk. Across generations, there are beta maps hidden just off camera, unused houses with no doors, and fully coded trainer classes in Ruby and Sapphire that never battle you in any normal playthrough. There are ghost NPCs in places like the old chateau that appear, stare, and vanish without ever being registered like normal characters. There are glitch spaces where the tiles loop wrong and the music stutters, as if the game is trying to keep the illusion going while the universe falls apart at the edges. And then there's the lore the games actually tell you. Pokédex entries that talk about Pokemon stealing children, wearing human skulls, or dragging souls into forests read less like friendly flavor text and more like horror microfiction. Someone hid under a layer of cute sprites. Why does a world this bright keep describing things that sound like campfire ghost stories? For now, though, just know that by the end of this video, Kanto, Johto, Sinnoh, all of them, won't just feel like flat maps anymore. They'll feel like layered palimpsests, new regions written over deleted ideas, ghost data, and half-told myths about wars, experiments, and gods. As we go, please let me know in the comments down below if you have your own favorite strange theory about these hidden spaces. I would love to hear them, because next, we're going to step a little closer to the edge of the map and see what happens when the game starts to break. So for this video, instead of just pointing at weird screenshots and going, "Huh, that's creepy," I want to talk about how all of these things actually fit together. We're going to move through the Pokemon universe almost like it has its own creation myth twice over. Once in universe, with Arceus and spirits and transformed humans, and once inside the cartridge, with memory tables, encounter data, and maps that only half exist. First, we'll start big. We'll look at how the world is supposedly created in the lore, how Arceus hatches from an egg in a kind of cosmic void, and then slowly narrow down into the code version of that same idea. How the games themselves are born from little grids of numbers that decide which Pokemon appear, where you can walk, and what happens when the game suddenly doesn't know what to do. What's interesting about this is that both myths break down in oddly similar ways when you push on them. From there, we'll drift into the places you were never really meant to see. Unused maps buried in the data of Ruby and Sapphire. fully coded but never use trainer classes that exist, but never actually show up to battle you. That strange, half-empty Kanto in gold and silver that literally sits on compressed red and green data, which is why so many routes feel like someone took scissors to your childhood and trimmed it down. These aren't just random leftovers. We're going to treat each of them like a puzzle piece in a pattern of how Game Freak hides, reuses, and quietly abandons content over time. Then, we'll take the same approach with the famous glitch worlds. Missing No, the old man glitch, the void in Sinnoh where you can walk for what feels like forever. On the surface, they're just bugs. But we'll look at them as little windows into how the game's memory is arranged, how encounter tables are created, and what happens when the game reaches into the wrong part of its own universe and just rolls with whatever garbage it pulls out. It's worth mentioning that you do not need to be a programmer to follow any of this. I'll keep it gentle and simple, especially if you're half asleep. In parallel, we'll keep checking in with the darker lore. The old chateau ghosts that appear with no explanation, creepy Pokédex entries that read more like horror flash fiction, and all those locked doors and silent NPCs that seem like they're hiding something. For now, though, just know that every time you walked past an empty house or a weird line of dialogue, there might have been cut content, a scrapped event, or a half-implemented mechanic sitting just off-screen. And toward the end, we'll get to some of the quietest secrets, things stranger than Missing No, hidden not in obvious glitch zones, but in ordinary places you've probably visited 100 times. If you've got your own favorite, wait, what does that imply? Moment, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear them. Because the further we go, the more it starts to feel like the games themselves are haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the earlier versions of the universe they were built on top of. So after wandering through all those haunted leftovers in the code, I want to talk about the one place where the games actually pretend everything is simple and clean. The official creation story. The bedtime story of the Pokemon universe. The version you'd read to a kid who keeps asking, where did all the Pokemon come from? Instead of, why is that ghost child in the old chateau not on the NPC list? In the beginning, according to Sinnoh's lore, there was nothing. No stars, no regions, no Pikachu merch. Just a quiet, endless void. Then, in that emptiness, an egg appeared. No explanation. No parents. Just an egg floating in the dark. From that egg, Arceus hatched, the original one. The first being to exist, the source of everything that came after. This is the Big Bang, but make it extremely egg. From there, the story gets grand fast. Arceus created Dialga to govern time, Palkia to shape space, and Giratina to embody antimatter or distortion, depending on which game text you're reading. These three supposedly stabilize the universe itself. Seconds ticking, distances stretching, reality not collapsing into a glitchy mess. Then, once those cosmic settings were in place, Arceus brought forth Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, the Lake Trio, as the spirits of knowledge, emotion, and willpower. So the order is very clear. First the universe, then the rules that make minds possible, then eventually everyone else. What's interesting about this is how often the games repeat it. Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum hit you with this myth from multiple angles. Canalav Library has those little in-game books spelling it out in storybook language. NPCs in Sinnoh talk about Arceus and the Lake Guardians, like they're half religious figure, half local cryptid. It's worth mentioning that for a series that did not put a lot of thought into its lore, they really committed to this one narrative. This is the closest thing Pokemon has to a shared official scripture, and it sets up a very neat hierarchy. At the top, you've got cosmic forces, time, space, antimatter. Under that, abstract concepts, knowledge, emotion, will. Below that, physical reality, land, sea, sky, and eventually regions and people. Finally, at the bottom, everyday life, all the Pokemon you actually catch. On paper, it's a beautifully organized universe, like someone tried to build a tier list for existence itself. For now, though, just hold that tidy structure in your head, because the games themselves keep bumping into it. Some Pokedex entries casually mention Pokemon haunting people since ancient times, or spirits that predate human memory, which raises the question, ancient compared to what exactly? There are hints of ruins older than Sinnoh's myth, strange fossils, and legends that don't mention Arceus at all, like entire cultures evolved under a different creation theory, and nobody reconciled the drafts. And the more you line these stories up, next to that perfect Arceus egg origin, the more cracks start to show. Why do some regions worship completely different first Pokemon? Why do certain ghost and psychic types seem to remember a world that doesn't match this one? If this is the official bedtime story, what else is the universe trying very hard not to talk about? And right at the center of all that silence sits Arceus. The games really want you to feel like this thing is not just a god, but the god. The egg in the void, the first heartbeat, the moment the universe decided it was finally time to boot up. But I want to talk about Arceus, not just as a deity, but as a system. Because mechanically, Arceus is basically a walking settings menu. Its signature ability, multi-type, lets it change its entire nature based on which plate you give it. Hand it a flame plate, and suddenly it's fire type. Give it a splash plate, now it's water. It's worth mentioning that under the hood, this is exactly what a developer does when they swap a data table and tell the game, okay, treat this thing as fire now. The lore says, omnipotent architect of reality. The code says, if plate equals X, then type equals Y. And then, from this extremely configurable god, the world gets its second layer of reality. Arceus creates the Lake Trio, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf. Knowledge, emotion, willpower. The scripture-style version is beautiful. And so, emotion was written into the hearts of humans and Pokemon alike, that they might weep and rejoice. And knowledge was granted, that they might understand. And willpower was bestowed, that they might act. What's interesting about this is that in-game, those grand concepts quietly map onto very normal systems. Friendship values, experience gain, obedience checks, even AI routines deciding whether a Pokemon attacks or switches. From there, the myth keeps stacking. Weather and nature legendaries like Gruden, Kyogre, Rayquaza, Tornadus, Thundurus, and Landorus don't just control land, sea, and sky. They're basically living sliders for encounter rates, climate, and battle conditions. And so, the rains were called forth, and the sun was stayed, that life might exist in balance. Translation: someone coded in permanent rain and drought, and then wrapped it in a dragon. Here's where the bedtime story starts arguing with itself. The lore presents Arceus as this singular, unreachable being, the One, the Alpha. Yet mechanically, the games can't quite commit. In some events and spin-offs, Arceus can be re-encountered, traded around like any other legendary, and in certain fan-accessible contexts, even bred or duplicated. This supposedly unique architect of the universe can be sitting in Box 3 next to 6 Bidoof and a Magikarp. If that doesn't break the illusion a little, I don't know what does. For now, though, just sit with that tension. On one side, you have scripture, plates, pillars, lake spirits carving emotion and knowledge into the world. On the other, you have flags, tables, and respawn conditions. And tucked between those two layers is where the really weird stuff starts to leak out. Glitches that turn roots into voids, ghost stories about forgotten maps, NPCs that act like they remember a different version of history entirely. If the god of this universe is half myth, half menu system, what happens when the menu misfires? Please let me know in the comments down below if you have your own theory about what that says about this world's reality, because I would love to hear them before we go deeper into the places where that reality fully breaks. So let's actually open the book for a second. Because for a series that pretends its lore is just window dressing, Pokemon loves hiding its weirdest ideas in very specific lines of text. I want to talk about the Kanalav Library in Sinnoh, because that place is basically the franchise quietly clearing its throat and going, by the way, the universe started with an egg in the void. One of the myths literally says there was nothing. Then an egg appeared, and from that egg, the being that created the world was born. No Arceus cutscene, no fanfare, just a dusty children's book, casually describing the birth of the universe. Another book says that in the beginning, Pokemon and humans ate at the same table and lived together as equals. Not trainers and partners, not owners and pets. Just people and Pokemon side by side, sharing food. What's interesting about this is that it doesn't read like metaphor. It sounds like a memory of a time before the hierarchy we're used to even existed. And then the Pokedex comes in and makes all of that so much messier. You get entries that say certain Pokemon were once human, or are literally human spirits. Yamask is the famous one. It carries a mask of its old face, and some entries say it cries when it remembers its past life. That's not kinda spooky. That's a straight-up ghost story about identity and death that they put in a kid's encyclopedia. Phantump? Supposedly the spirit of a child who died in the forest, now possessing a tree stump. Drifloon is said to grab children's hands and try to drag them away. Kadabra's lore mentions a boy who woke up one morning as this Pokemon. At that point, you don't have a clean separation between human and Pokemon anymore. You have a revolving door. Now, technically, all of this is just flavor text. The official line is basically, don't worry about it, it's just world building. But in a series as tightly controlled as Pokemon, when you see the same themes popping up over and over, transformation, possession, lost souls, it's worth mentioning that it starts to feel intentional. Somebody wrote, approved, translated, and reapproved these lines across multiple generations and regions. If you read them slowly, almost like an ASMR track, they get even weirder. Each retains memories of its former life. For Yamask, according to old tales, these Pokemon are stumps possessed by the spirits of children who died while lost in the forest. For Phantump, it is whispered that any child who mistakes Drifloon for a balloon and holds onto it could wind up missing. For Drifloon, just let that sit there for a second. And notice how this quietly contradicts the neat Arceus creation myth. If humans can become Pokemon, or leave ghosts that become Pokemon, where do humans actually sit in the cosmic hierarchy Arceus supposedly established? Are they below Pokemon? Equal to them? Raw material for them? The games never really answer that. For now, though, you can keep that tension in mind, because once we step away from the official books and into the broken edges of the games themselves, that blurred line between human, Pokemon, and something else gets even harder to ignore. And once you start looking at the broken edges, something else weird pops out. This world sometimes acts like it existed, long before its supposed gods ever clocked in for work. I want to talk about how often the games casually say Earth, like it's no big deal. In multiple Pokédex entries, Palkia is said to live in a gap in the spatial dimension and control space, so that space becomes more stable. That sounds grand and cosmic, sure, but notice what's missing. There's no line about Palkia creating the planet from nothing. No description of the literal birth of the world. It's managing dimensions around an already existing stage, not building the stage itself. What's interesting about this is that other entries and dialogue lean even harder into a pre-existing Earth. You get descriptions of Pokemon that came from space and crashed into the planet, which only makes sense if the planet was already sitting there, minding its own business, before these cosmic beings showed up. The universe feels like it was in progress, and then the legendaries arrived and started taking credit. It's worth mentioning that the human side of the lore quietly does the same thing. In several games, you get lines about ancient people discovering Pokemon, or learning to live alongside them, as if humans were wandering around first and only later realized, oh, these weird elemental animals are everywhere. That implies a slow, messy history where humans and Pokemon adapt to each other over time, not two species created hand in hand in some perfect divine rollout. Then you've got fossils, ruins, and those lost civilizations that keep getting name-dropped and then abandoned. The people of Sinnoh who carved the spear pillar, the ancient kings of Unova, the mysterious ruins in Johto and Hoenn, the relic castle, half swallowed by sand. All of that points to a ridiculous amount of deep time baked into this world. Layer after layer of history, extinction events, and forgotten empires. And yet, the Arceus myth mostly skips straight from Cosmic Egg to, and then there were people, and Pokemon. Where did all those intermediate ages fit? Did Arceus patch the timeline later? Did someone just not get the memo? At this point, the contradictions stop feeling like simple mistakes and start feeling like something more familiar. Different cultures in-game writing their own creation myths. Sinnoh monks say Arceus created everything. Hoenn elders talk about Groudon and Kyogre, shaping land and sea. Kalos remembers a war and a weapon, not a god. The games never pick a single official story. They just let all of them exist side by side, like competing fan theories that no one wants to delete. And that's where it gets really fun, because the games themselves might be doing the exact same thing. Gold and Silver literally compress Kanto into a smaller, half-erased version of itself, stacking a new journey on top of old data. So if the regions are built on top of their own previous worlds, quietly overwritten but not fully deleted, what happens when we start digging into the leftover code, the glitches, and the ghost data, the way in-universe archaeologists dig through ruins? So to answer that, I want to talk about how the games themselves are actually built, because the answer is way more physical and way more cursed than you'd expect. We've been in the realm of gods and eggs in the void, but now we're dropping straight into tile maps and memory addresses. Very glamorous. Early Pokemon games basically built their worlds out of tiny Lego pieces. Each town, each cave, each route is a grid of little tiles stored in the cartridge, and the game just keeps a list that says, use grass tile here, use water tile here, use house roof here. On top of that, there are encounter tables that say which Pokemon can appear in each area, and then little scripts that say things like, when the player talks to this NPC, show this text, maybe start a battle. All of that has to coexist in a tiny amount of memory, so nothing can be wasted. If a tile or a line of dialogue, or a route layout can be reused, it will be. What's interesting about this is how it shaped the birth of Johto. When Game Freak created Gold and Silver, they really wanted you to go back to Kanto after beating the League. But they didn't have the space to just copy-paste the original region from Red and Green. So they did something way weirder. They compressed it, shrank it down, and rebuilt it on top of reused data, like a second layer of wallpaper over an older pattern. That's why post-game Kanto feels like a dream version of itself. You walk Route 1 and it's there, but it's shorter. Or towns are missing buildings. Interiors are simplified. Some routes basically exist as straight lines, like the memory of a road instead of the road itself. It's the same world, and not the same world. A kind of second-hand Kanto that remembers the important landmarks and quietly forgets everything else. It's worth mentioning that this isn't just a vibe thing. It's literally how the data is organized. Kanto in Gold and Silver is packed into leftover space, built over compressed map chunks, reusing tiles, reusing scripts, even cutting corners on music. You're walking through a region that had to be flattened and folded just to exist at all. And suddenly that starts to sound a lot like the lore. Arceus creates a universe out of nothing. Then other beings reshape it, overwrite it, seal things away. Game Freak does the same thing, layering Johto on top of the ghost of Red and Green's Kanto, letting one world stand on the remains of another. Here's the pattern interrupt. When you stack realities like that, you don't always erase the old one cleanly. You get seams. You get leftovers. You get ghost data. And that's where the really strange stuff lives. Because if tiles, maps, and scripts are being reused and half deleted, that means there are spaces in the code that were once something else, and now aren't supposed to be anything at all. Most of the time, you never see those places. But sometimes, through glitches, bad pointers, or just the game tripping over its own encounter tables, you fall through the cracks. You end up in a void map, or a broken route, or facing something like Missing No. That's just the machine trying to interpret garbage as a Pokemon. And if the universe of Pokemon is built on layers, then those glitch worlds are like unfinished basements under the regions we know. For now, though, keep that image in mind, because next I want to talk about what it actually feels like to wander those basements, and how much of that was never meant for human eyes in the first place. There's a version of Kanto quietly buried inside your copy of Gold and Silver, and the game lets you walk through its corpse. I want to talk about Johto's post-game Kanto, because on the surface it's this fun nostalgia tour, but underneath it's our first real ghost world in the series. You beat the Elite Four, the credits roll, and suddenly the game says, surprise, the entire previous region also exists. That sounds insanely generous for a Game Boy Color cartridge, until you actually get there and realize how much has been carved away. Routes are shorter. Whole areas are missing. Buildings are just gone. And what's interesting about this is that it's not only a story decision, it's a hardware autopsy. The original Red and Green Kanto barely fit on a Game Boy cart by itself. Gold and Silver had to cram an entirely new region, a real-time clock, new Pokemon, new mechanics, and then somehow still include Kanto. So they did it by literally shrinking it, compressing and repurposing the old map data so it could exist in a much smaller footprint. Internally, that Kanto isn't lovingly rebuilt from scratch. It's worth mentioning that a lot of it is straight-up recycled data from Red and Green, squeezed, chopped, and stitched together. Tiles are reassigned, layouts are simplified, and chunks of the old world are overwritten to save memory. Fans digging through the code found that the way the maps are arranged in memory lines up with the original games, just with pieces missing, like a puzzle that someone trimmed with scissors to make it fit a smaller frame. And you feel that the moment you try to revisit your old haunts, you walk up to where Viridian Forest should be, this sprawling maze that, in your memory, took ages of your childhood time. In Gold and Silver, it's reduced to a tiny optional side area. In Crystal, or just a simple route with some trees. The Safari Zone, this huge, mysterious playground from Red and Blue, is closed indefinitely. The gate exists, the building exists, but the zone itself is gone, sealed off as if the world moved on without you. Is it really under renovation, or did the universe just delete it to save space? Routes like 23 are truncated, caves are smaller, interiors are locked. You can see the ghosts of what used to exist. In the way paths suddenly dead-end or bend around nothing. Fans data-mined leftover references to maps that never appear. Bits of header data, and stray tiles that suggest there were plans for more of Kanto than we ever got. In some prototypes, you can even find rougher versions of these areas that were later erased. So Kanto in Gold and Silver ends up existing in two places at once. As the full, vibrant region you remember from Red and Blue, and as this diminished echo built over its own ruins. It's a region that feels like it's been eroded by time, when really it was eroded by memory limits. But the result is the same. You're walking through a half-remembered world. To me, that's our first big ghost world in Pokemon. A place that clearly used to be bigger, richer, and more alive, now surviving as a compressed memory inside a newer game. And if a whole region can quietly rot away like that, what else in this universe has been paved over? If you have your own theories about what Kanto used to look like in Gold and Silver's code, I would love to hear them. And next, I want to talk about the other places where the series accidentally lets you peek behind the drywall of its world. So if the maps themselves can rot and get built over, the next weird question is, what happens to the people who were supposed to live there? Because buried in the code, there are trainers and NPCs who are just as real, just as fully created, and yet they never get to exist on screen. I want to talk about Ruby and Sapphire here, because this is where it gets especially eerie. Data miners cracked open the ROM and found fully coded trainer classes that you never fight in any normal playthrough. We're talking proper names, sprites, teams, even post-battle quotes. They're not half-finished experiments. They look like co-workers who showed up to the office and then got told the building doesn't exist anymore. What's interesting about this is the battle text. Some of these unseen trainers have lines that clearly hint at roles they were meant to play. A line about training in a specific route that no longer has them. A comment that sounds like they were part of some early game tutorial. You can feel the outline of a storyline the developers built, tested, and then quietly sliced out at the last second, leaving the actors still waiting in the wings. It's worth mentioning that this isn't just a Hoenn thing either. Across the series, when people dig through the data, they keep finding these ghost jobs. Unused cool trainer variants, specialty classes that sound like they were tied to cut facilities, even battle messages that reference locations that don't exist anymore in the final world layout. The theory is always the same. Late redesign, not enough cartridge space, timelines slipping. But from the inside, from the point of view of the game's own little universe, it feels like history that was overwritten in real time. For now, though, shift from the code to what you actually see on screen. The empty houses and locked doors. Especially in the older games, You'll walk into a perfectly normal house in, say, Johto or Hoenn. There's a table, maybe two beds, a TV. It's laid out exactly like every other home that hosts a chatty NPC, or a weird guy who gives you a fishing rod. But here, nobody. No events, just silence and furniture. In a series as tightly curated as Pokemon, these blank interiors feel wrong in a very specific way. They don't read like, "we forgot to put something here." They read like, "something used to be here, and we took it out." Same with those locked doors in places like Lumiose, or the random buildings in Kanto that never open. The world acts like they matter, but time has passed them by. So you end up with this strange parallel. Ghost Pokemon are the souls that didn't move on, and ghost content is the storylines that never made it to birth. Unused trainers waiting for battles that never start. Empty homes waiting for families who never spawn. And if the people can vanish like that, what does that say about the few NPCs who are left, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, saying things that don't quite add up? Because next, I want to talk about them. And the thing is, it's not just the people who feel wrong. Even the parts of the world you can see are being quietly controlled by numbers and rules the game refuses to actually tell you about. I want to talk about that invisible second layer of reality, because once you notice it, the whole Pokemon universe starts to feel way stranger. Take friendship, or happiness. On the surface, it's this cute idea. You travel with your Pokemon, you win battles, you don't yeet them into the PC every 5 seconds, and they like you more. Nice. But under the hood, there's a hidden stat ticking up and down, and in the early games, you never see it. There's no bar, no percentage, nothing. Yet that unseen number literally decides if your Eevee becomes Acebayan or Umbreon, if your Togepi ever evolves, and how strong moves like Return or Frustration actually are. The game just throws you a vague NPC, like your Pokemon seems to like you, as if that's actionable data. What's interesting about this is that the series keeps pretending this is all about bond and heart, while secretly doing math in the background. Return can hit like a truck because some invisible counter maxed out. Frustration punishes you for mistreating your team, but again, only the code knows how much. It's like the lore talks about love and trust, and the cartridge is quietly running a spreadsheet. Then you've got IVs, individual values. These are basically genetic soul numbers each Pokemon is born with at the moment of its digital birth. 6 hidden values, one for each stat, that decide how far that creature can ever go. 2 Pikachu at level 50 might look identical to you, but one secretly has perfect IVs, and the other is doomed to be slightly worse forever. In the original games, there's no way to see this without outside tools. The universe has written your partner's potential in invisible ink, and the game shrugs and says, "Don't worry about it." It's worth mentioning that the world itself is doing this too. Every patch of grass, every cave corridor, is governed by encounter tables, slots and percentages deciding which Pokemon can appear and how often. When you're a kid, it feels random. In reality, Route 1 is basically a vending machine, with Pidgey in slot 1, Rattata in slot 2, and a bunch of empty or unused entries after that. And when glitches shove the pointer into those undefined slots, the game starts pulling garbage data and trying to treat it like a real creature. That's where things like Missing No come from. The physics of the world break for a second, and you see the raw, untextured code underneath. This is the same universe where people tell campfire stories about legendary Pokemon and creation myths, but they have no idea their reality is being held together by encounter rates and invisible DNA rolls. For now, though, Just keep in mind, when those hidden systems misfire or point into empty space, you don't just get weird numbers. You get voids, glitch dimensions, and things that should not exist slipping onto your screen. And the really fun part is what happens when the places themselves start acting like that. And nowhere is that clearer than with the most famous mistake in the entire series. A Pokemon that technically does not exist, but absolutely changed the way people thought about the games. I want to talk about Missing No. If you grew up with Red and Blue, you probably at least heard whispers about this thing. The setup sounded like playground nonsense. First, you talk to the old man in Viridian City and watch his catching tutorial. Then, instead of just moving on with your life like a normal person, you immediately fly to Cinnabar Island, walk to the right edge, and surf up and down that razor-thin coastline. Do this, and suddenly the calm blue ocean becomes a glitch buffet. Level 100 Pokemon, scrambled sprites, and, if you're lucky, that jagged, blocky creature labeled Missing No. What's interesting about this is that it's not random at all. The game is following rules. Very weird. Very brittle rules. When the old man shows you how to catch Pokemon, the game temporarily overwrites your player name in memory, so it can display Old Man instead. To save space, it reuses the same area of memory that normally holds the encounter data for wild Pokemon. Then, when you fly to Cinnabar, the coastline tiles don't have proper encounter data of their own, so the game just keeps using whatever was left in that spot. In other words, your name gets fed into the encounter table. Each character of your name corresponds to an internal index number. Invalid numbers point to real Pokemon. Invalid ones point to nothing, or to values that were never meant to represent a creature at all. That's where Missing No lives, in the gaps between what the game expects to find and what actually exists. When the game hits one of those empty slots, it still tries its best. It has no concept of, this should not exist. So it grabs sprite data from one place, cries from another, stats from somewhere else, and stitches them together into a kind of digital chimera. That's why Missing No looks like a broken Tetris stack and screams with someone else's cry. It's the game interpreting garbage data as if it were a normal Pokemon, because it was never created with the idea that you'd push its memory this far. And then you get the side effects. Your 6th item slot suddenly has 128 more of whatever was there. Hall of Fame entries melt into corrupted hieroglyphs. Sometimes the overworld graphics smear and flicker, like the cartridge is forgetting what reality is supposed to look like. It's worth mentioning that none of this is haunted. It's just the game's memory, fraying at the edges, when it's forced to render something that doesn't fit its own rules. So Missing No isn't really a monster. It's a window. A tiny, accidental debug menu that kids could open just by following a rumor. Through it, you see that the cozy Kanto world is actually held together by tables, indexes, and shortcuts that were never meant to be exposed. And if one simple tutorial and a short surf can rip the curtain back this far, what happens when entire maps or regions are built on leftover data the same way? And if one simple tutorial can show you the scaffolding under Kanto, then Sinnoh takes that idea and just deletes the floor. I want to talk about the moment Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum stop being cozy RPGs and briefly turn into existential walking simulators. Because in Sinnoh, you can literally walk off the map. Using certain step-through walls, glitches, or wrong warps, players figured out how to slide past collision, slip through a door at just the wrong frame, and suddenly end up outside the boundaries of the region. 1 second you're in Jubilife, or the Pokemon League. The next you're standing on a single tile with nothing around you but pure, black nothingness. No trees, no houses, no music change. Just you and the void the game was never supposed to show you. What's interesting about this is that the void isn't actually empty. The game world is basically a big grid, and all the real places are just little rectangles of content floating in that darkness. Hidden event maps, unused rooms, weird test corridors the developers used and then abandoned. All of that still exists out there. If you know the right coordinates, or you walk long enough in a straight line, you can just bump into them. So you get these eerie stories of players marching north for 10 solid minutes, watching the screen stay almost completely black. Every few seconds, a tile flickers in, then vanishes, like the universe is trying and failing to remember what it's supposed to render. Time keeps passing. The step sound effect keeps playing. But visually, it's just your tiny sprite and an endless backdrop of nothing. As if Arceus forgot to finish this part of creation. It's worth mentioning that this turns the entire idea of the Pokemon world into a stage set. Towns and routes aren't continuous landmasses. They're little islands that the game teleports you between. The void is the backstage, the rafters, the messy storage room full of props and half-built scenery. You were meant to believe in a whole region. Under the hood, the universe is more like a handful of dioramas surrounded by digital night. And of course, because this is Pokemon, the juiciest lore bits are hiding back there. Some of the most coveted event areas in Sinnoh, like the Hall of Origin where Arceus is meant to descend, can be reached by navigating the void. No official item, no mythical distribution, just raw glitch energy, turning empty darkness into a secret highway between divine spaces. For now, though, the games pretend this path doesn't exist, that the gods only appear when the script says so. But if the backstage of Sinnoh lets you crash Arceus's private balcony just by walking into nothing, what else is hiding in these forgotten corners of the universe? And what happens when the glitch worlds stop being accidents and start looking intentional? And that's the thing. Sometimes the game stops pretending it's an accident. Sometimes it builds a glitch world on purpose and just doesn't tell you. I want to talk about the old chateau, because this is where Sinnoh stops being cosmic and quietly turns into a straight-up ghost story. You reach it by stepping off the main path in Eterna Forest, into this rotting mansion that feels like it was imported from a different game. No NPCs, no quest marker, just a locked front door and a soundtrack that sounds less like, "Go catch some cute Pokemon," and more like, "Something died here and never left." The floors creak, the lights flicker, the wallpaper is peeling. It's the opposite of Jubilife's bright TV-filled world. It feels like the birth of a horror spin-off that never got created. What's interesting about this is how little the game does to reassure you. There's no friendly guide, no, "Hey, this place is spooky, but don't worry." Instead, Diamond and Pearl just let you wander into this empty dining room, or that long hallway. And then, if the game feels like it, the mansion blinks first. A butler silently glides across the dining room, never turning, never speaking, just drifting out of frame. If you try to chase him, he's gone. No fade out, no teleport animation. He simply stops existing. Upstairs, it gets worse. In one of the bedrooms, a little girl appears in the corner and floats sideways out of the room, completely ignoring collision like she's clipping through the universe. Again, no dialogue box, no explanation. You can spend the entire rest of your playthrough waiting for someone to acknowledge that you just saw a child ghost casually phase through reality, and the game will never bring it up. It's worth mentioning that for a series that loves to over-explain friendship mechanics and fishing rods, that silence feels very deliberate. Then data miners looked under the hood and found out these ghosts are weird, even by NPC standards. They don't show up in the normal internal NPC list like your average hiker or galactic grunt. Instead, they're spawned by special scripts and flags that sit off to the side, as if the developers wanted even the code to treat them like they don't really exist in the same way everyone else does. They're there, but also not there. Like Missing No's classy cousin who haunts a mansion instead of your save file, and the game never directly tells you who they are. You're left squinting at item descriptions, reading the Rotom room notes, noticing the creepy portrait eyes that seem to follow you, and trying to stitch together a theory about an owner, a family, a death that the official lore refuses to spell out. For now, though, all you get are implications and a mansion that feels frozen in time. So the old chateau ends up as this intentional ghost story embedded inside the main adventure, but built with the same kind of out-of-bounds tricks as a glitch. It exists in Sinnoh, yet its characters barely exist in the code. And if the series is willing to hide a whole haunted house like that, what else is lurking in the background? Especially in places where the dead aren't nearly as quiet. And if the series is willing to hide a whole haunted house like that, then we kind of have to go back to the place where it stopped hiding at all, because long before the old chateau was quietly stitched into Sinnoh's woods, Kanto already had a full-on town whose entire identity was death. I want to talk about Lavender Town. In red and blue, lavender hits you the second you walk in. The music isn't heroic, or adventurous, or even spooky in a fun way. It's this droning, off-kilter lullaby that feels like it got lost on the way to a different game. The color palette, especially on old Game Boy hardware, is washed out and sickly. No bright greens or bold reds, just muted purples and grays like the whole world is permanently overcast. And right in the middle of it all is Pokemon Tower. Not a gym, not a lab, but a massive graveyard, stacked floor after floor into the sky. Inside, the game quietly shifts tone. NPCs aren't talking about badges or trades. They're crying over tombstones. You get lines like, "I'm a Chaneller." There are spirits up to mischief, right next to kids mourning their dearly departed partners. For a series that was literally marketed around catching as many creatures as possible, this is the first time it calmly tells you some of them don't exist anymore. And then there's the Marowak ghost. What's interesting about this is how blunt the premise is, and how little the game dwells on it. Team Rocket invaded the tower, tried to take Cubone, and straight up killed its mother. Her spirit is now an uncatchable, unnamed ghost blocking the staircase. You can't throw a Pokeball at it. You can't add it to your team. You just have to confront it, identify it, and set it free. That's it. No cutscene, no big speech. Just a murdered mother whose unresolved grief is a literal gameplay obstacle. It's worth mentioning how wild that is for the first generation. These are the same games where a guy shows you how to catch Pokemon with a Weedle tutorial. And then 5 minutes later, you're helping a child deal with parental death via exorcism. The script moves on like it was just another dungeon, but the implications hang over the whole region. Team Rocket doesn't just steal Pokemon, they kill them. Your 10-year-old protagonist doesn't just battle ghosts, they help one move on. How many other things in this universe died off screen that the game never bothers to explain? Later generations clearly blinked. The remakes soften the track, add the radio tower instead of a full grave spire, and spread memorials out into places like Mount Pyre and the Lost Tower. Lavender becomes less of a pure grief town and more of a quirky side stop with some nostalgia merch. But the original version never really left the fandom's head. It's still the anchor for a ton of theories about the hidden darkness of this world, the supposed Lavender Town syndrome, the idea that the music somehow caused real distress, the sense that this was the one place where the mask slipped. From there, you can see a pattern forming. Ghostly spaces keep popping up. The old chateau in Sinnoh, the lost tower in Johto, Mount, Pyre in Hoenn, even places like the strange house in the Mali Library. The series is completely comfortable telling you that spirits exist, that Pokemon and people can linger after death, that entire buildings can be haunted. But it almost never explains the rules. Why is Marowak a single, unique ghost, while Ghastly and Haunter are just a species? Why do some souls rest in towers and others in forests or paintings? Does Arceus oversee any of this? Or is the afterlife just another part of the map no one bothered to document? For now, though, Lavender Town stands as the prototype. A whole location built around mourning, sitting right in the middle of your badge quest, like a speed bump made of feelings. And once you realize the games were willing to go that far, it makes the next layer of hidden darkness, stuff buried not in the story, but in the code itself, feel a lot less accidental. And if Lavender Town is the mourning hall everyone remembers, the really unsettling stuff is hiding in plain sight in the Pokédex. Because for a game that never wants to talk about death directly, the Pokédex cannot stop writing tiny horror stories. I want to talk about Yamask first, because this one quietly rewrites the rules of the whole universe. Its entry flat out says it used to be human. It carries a mask that looks like its old face. When it looks at the mask, it cries. Not metaphorically. Not, "It seems sad." It remembers its human life. That means human memory, human emotion, and human identity can survive the death of the body and get reassigned into a ghost type. The game just drops that in there like it's describing a slightly quirky balloon. What's interesting about this is how far that idea spreads once you notice it. Phantump is described as the spirit of a child who got lost in the forest and died, now possessing a rotten stump. Banette is an abandoned plush doll whose grudge was so strong it came to life, zipping its mouth to contain cursed energy. These aren't just spooky aesthetics. They're telling you that strong emotions in this world literally create new Pokemon. Grief, resentment, loneliness. They don't just hurt. They reshape reality and give birth to new beings that can battle your starter. It's worth mentioning how aggressively messed up that is if you slow down for even a second. A kid dies in the woods, and instead of a funeral, the lore says, "Congrats, you're a tiny tree ghost now. Enjoy Hex." A toy gets thrown away, and instead of going to a landfill, it becomes a vengeful zipper demon. The line between object, person, and Pokemon isn't a line anymore. It's just vibes and unresolved trauma. Then you get Drifloon, which looks adorable and is famously described as grabbing children's hands and trying to drag them away. Some entries even say kids mistake it for a balloon and vanish. Frozlass is said to be born from a woman who died in the mountains, now luring people to their icy deaths. Kadabra's early lore claims a boy with psychic powers woke up one morning and had turned into a Kadabra. No ritual, no Arceus beam from the sky. He just evolved into a different species in his sleep. If that can happen once, what's stopping it from happening again? What makes this creepier is how scattered it all is. These entries are spread across regions and generations, never pulled together into a single grand theory. No professor ever sits you down and explains, "So by the way, you might turn into a ghost type at any time." Instead, the world feels like a patchwork of local legends and half-remembered campfire stories that accidentally add up to something much darker. And it raises a question the games never want to answer directly. If humans can become Pokemon, and Pokemon can literally be the ghosts of humans, what exactly is the boundary between trainer and partner here? Are you catching animals? Or are you recruiting former people who just don't remember enough to object? If you have your own theories about that, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear them. Because the next layer of secrets doesn't just live in the text we can read. It lives in the parts of the games we were never meant to see at all. It lives in the parts of the games we were never meant to see at all. And I want to talk about one more kind of silence the series leans on all the time. The places where canon just refuses to answer basic questions. Because for a franchise that loves to over-explain how friendship values work, or how Dynamax energy fills the stadium, Pokemon is weirdly shy about its darkest implications. We have dozens of Pokédex entries that straight up say humans become Pokemon or ghosts, but the main stories almost never show that happening on screen. You never watch a kid in Jubilife slowly turn into a Ralts. You never see that lost child from Phantom's entry actually die in a forest. The game just drops the line, smiles, and sends you off to the next gym. Take your mask. Its whole thing is that it carries a mask of its former human face and cries when it remembers its past life. That is horrifying. But you never see the moment of transformation, never meet the person before they turned, never get a cutscene where a spirit chooses to become a Pokemon. What's interesting about this is how consistent that avoidance is. The lore keeps telling you, hey, people turn into things. And then the camera cuts away every single time. And that ties into the next big gap. What even is a ghost type? Really? The games never give you a clean, canonical definition. Are they dead Pokemon, dead humans, or some third kind of being that just sort of exists between worlds? Drifloon supposedly steals children. Froslas is a woman who died in the mountains. Delmise is literally seaweed possessing an anchor. Those are three completely different origin stories for the same type, and the narrative never sits you down and says, by the way, here's how ghosts actually work in this universe. It's worth mentioning that legendary Pokemon are in the same boat. Sometimes they're treated like unique gods whose birth shaped reality itself. Arceus creates time and space. Dialga and Palkia feel one of a kind. But then you have stuff like Heatran, which is legendary, but has a gender, and can exist in multiple games at once. Or the Tapus, which are clearly a set of regional guardian deities. Are these singular beings, or are they rare species? The world never settles on one answer. At this point, it really feels deliberate. These aren't just plot holes. They're negative space the writers keep choosing not to fill in. They created all this specific, creepy detail, then stopped just short of a unified explanation, like they want you to build your own theory wall in your head, and honestly, that's where a lot of the fun lies. For now, though, I want to treat those silences as their own kind of evidence. If the games won't say what ghosts are, or how humans become Pokemon, or why some legendaries are unique and others act like species, then we're free to test different answers against the text we do have. In the next sections, we're going to walk calmly through a few competing explanations for all of this, always anchored in specific in-game lore and moments. If you already have a favorite headcanon, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear them, because from here on out, we're stepping fully into theory territory. So let's start with maybe the most straightforward version of all this. What if the Pokédex isn't exaggerating and the world is just literally haunted? Not metaphorically, not spooky folklore, but actually packed with dead people that now exist as Pokemon. I want to talk about the entries that don't even try to hide this. Take Yamask. Its whole deal is that it carries a mask that used to be its human face, and some entries say it looks at that mask and cries, remembering its past life. That's not symbolic of regret. That's the game calmly telling you, this was a person, they died, and now you can catch them in a ball and make them use Shadow Ball on command. Phantump is the same flavor of nightmare. According to the lore, it's the spirit of a child who died in the forest, possessing a rotted tree stump. Not lost, not went missing. Died. And now this kid tree hybrid is just another thing you can casually farm for EVs. What's interesting about this is how blunt the wording is. The game never winks at you. It just drops dead child ghost and moves on. Then you've got Froslass, which is said to be a woman who died in the mountains and was reborn as a Pokemon that freezes people and displays them like decorations. Drifloon is literally described as grabbing children's hands and trying to drag them away, which implies at least some of those kids don't come back. Duskull stalks misbehaving kids and can pass through any wall to find them. This isn't rare, fringe stuff. This is a whole subcategory of monsters explicitly built out of human death, fear, and sometimes outright kidnapping. If we take all of that at face value, the theory that falls out is pretty wild. The Pokemon world is saturated with lingering human souls, to the point where every root, cave, and forest is basically a low-key graveyard. Trainers aren't just catching animals or elemental spirits. They're unknowingly catching former people, former children, and throwing them into tournaments. Imagine half your team being reincarnated villagers and nobody comments on it. Extend that a bit further, and ghost-type legendaries and mythicals start to look even weirder. Things like Giratina ruling over a distorted afterlife dimension, or Marshado lurking in the shadows of fighters, could easily be read as what happens when especially powerful or ancient human souls get elevated over time, worshipped as gods, and eventually crystallized into proper legendary Pokemon. Maybe Arceus created the framework of the universe, but the ghosts are what's left of everyone who's lived in it. It's worth mentioning, though, that this theory runs straight into a tone problem. The games treat ghost types as quirky typing options, cute mascots, or mildly creepy puzzles. They're everywhere. If every Yamask and Phantump is a dead person, that implies a staggering body count the story never acknowledges. For now, though, hold on to that tension, because the next theory tries to explain why the world can be this haunted, and yet everyone acts like it's completely normal. So if the world is allegedly overflowing with literal human ghosts, we should be living in Silent Hill with Pikachu, not a cozy JRPG where kids trade Haunter like baseball cards. And this is where Theory A really starts to crack. I want to talk about the numbers first, because they get ridiculous fast. Think about how many ghost types you can catch across the regions. Rose of Litwick in Unova, Wild Phantump and Pumpkaboo in Kalos. Entire graveyards full of Ghastly and Misdreavus. If every one of those is a one-to-one dead person, that implies a catastrophic, ongoing mass casualty event the story never even hints at. No ruined cities, no memorial walls, just a background genocide, politely ignored while we do gym challenges. What's interesting about this is that the games quietly treat ghost types as a normal part of the ecosystem. Many of them can breed and hatch from eggs like any other Pokemon. You can put a Jengar in the daycare, come back later, and boom, ghastly egg. That doesn't line up with the idea that each ghost is a unique, once human soul with a tragic backstory. Are we saying the daycare couple is somehow facilitating the mass production of tortured spirits? That's a very different game rating. It's worth mentioning that some Pokédex entries straight up contradict or soften the edgier ones. One generation will say, Phantom is a dead child lost in the forest. Another will describe it more like a nature spirit born from a rotten stump. Or Drifloon steals children in one entry. Then later it's more about it being light and getting carried away by the wind. That inconsistency suggests that at least some of these lines are in-universe myths. Campfire stories told by frightened locals rather than literal, Arceus-approved fact. And then there's the tone problem. In this universe, trainers happily send out Banette and Froslas in friendly tournaments, beauty contests, school battles. Nobody stops the match to say, hey, why are you weaponizing the soul of a betrayed doll or a frozen woman? The world acts like these are just quirky elemental creatures. Imagine the announcer in the battle tower having to say, in a peppy voice, and here comes yet another vengeful human spirit, every single time. So Theory A captures the creepiness of the text, but it probably over-literalizes a bunch of flavor entries that were created as spooky folklore more than hard canon. Ghost types can still be weird, liminal beings without every single one being a dead guy with a social security number. For now, though, keep that in mind as we move on, because the next step is asking a much stranger question. If a lot of this is just in-universe storytelling, who exactly is doing the storytelling, and what else are they hiding from us? So here's the wild pivot. What if the Pokédex is less a divine tablet of truth and more the world's messiest group project? Instead of one omniscient narrator, imagine dozens of professors, interns, and random field researchers from different regions, different eras, all cramming their notes into the same device over time. I want to talk about that as a theory, because once you see the Pokédex as a patchwork of voices, the really disturbing entries start to look a lot like in-universe urban legends. You've got a Sinnoh grad student writing down what their grandma swore about Drifloon stealing kids at dusk, and then a more cautious Unovan researcher going, it mostly just plays with them. Probably. Same Pokemon, same universe, totally different cultural spin. That's not a plot hole. That's anthropology with extra steps. What's interesting about this is how cleanly it explains the contradictions. In one region, Banette is a possessed doll, hunting down the child that abandoned it. In another, it's framed more as a vengeful spirit in general. You can read that as Game Freak being inconsistent, or you can read it as local superstition solidifying into fact once it gets written into the Pokédex. If a story's been told for 100 years in a fishing village, and then a professor finally shows up with a fancy gadget, are they really going to say, actually, your ghost doll isn't that mad? Probably not. The human becoming Pokemon stuff fits this really well too. Instead of taking this person turned into a Yamask as a literal, you can treat it as metaphor people created to explain rare, unsettling things. A villager who starts wandering at night, staring at old ruins, might get described as already half a ghost. Someone who lives in the forest, never speaks, and fights like a monster. Over time, the story smooths out. They didn't just act like a Pokemon. They became one. It's a narrative shortcut to describe behavior that, at the time, nobody had the language or the science for. And this actually makes the horror sharper, not softer. Because now you're in a universe where people are surrounded by creatures they don't fully understand, with powers that can warp space, erase memories, or swallow entire ships. Of course, they fill the gaps with myths, cautionary tales, and campfire stories that accidentally get fossilized as data. The Pokédex becomes a haunted wiki, where half the entries are peer-reviewed, and the other half are your uncle's story about nearly getting dragged into the sea by a jellicent. It's worth mentioning that this mirrors how the games themselves are built. Just like there are half-believed stories in the lore, there are half-finished maps and unused trainers still lurking in the code. Gold and silver literally compress parts of Kanto from red and green, so you're walking through this shrunken ghost region that feels like a memory of a place more than the place itself. Ruby and Sapphire hide fully coded trainer classes. You never legitimately fight. Even missing No is basically the game, reaching into the void and pulling out garbage data, then pretending it's a real Pokemon because it has to make something exist in that slot. For now, though, keep that parallel in mind. A world of glitches in both story and software. Because if the Pokédex can lie, or at least exaggerate, then the next question is, how much of the official history of this universe is just another rumor that nobody ever debugged? And nowhere does that rumor that never got debugged feeling show up more than with legendary Pokemon themselves. The games act like these are one-of-a-kind sacred beings, and then immediately hand-wave that away the second it would be inconvenient for a battle system. I want to talk about this myth of uniqueness because what's interesting about this is that a lot of it is just game design, wearing a lore costume. In the main series, most legendaries are hard-coded as 1-per-save encounters. You meet them once, the music goes crazy. The game basically screams, "This is special, don't mess it up." But that's mostly to keep you from spamming 6 Kyogre on a team. Not necessarily to say, in-universe. Only 1 Kyogre can exist across all of space and time. It's worth mentioning that the moment you step outside that narrow mechanical frame, the illusion cracks. We see multiple Latias S all over the place. The anime has different Latios and Latias in different movies and series. Events distribute more than one, and ORAS even lets you soar around on one, while your friend also owns one. Heatran, who the Pokédex calls a legendary, is straight up implied by Sinnoh lore to be a species. There's a male and female, and later games just casually drop a second Heatran into events like that was always normal. Then there are the legendaries that can actually breed. Manaphy can create Phione, which is somehow not legendary, but also can't evolve back, like a weird genetic off-brand. In spin-offs, you'll sometimes fight a legendary, as if it's just a strong monster in a dungeon, not the one singular embodiment of storms or whatever. So which is it? Are these gods? Or are they just really rare birds and dragons with better theme music? Contrast that with something like Arceus or Giratina. Those aren't just powerful Pokemon. They're framed as singular cosmic forces baked into the birth of the universe. Arceus is literally described as the thing that created time, space, and the world itself. Giratina rules an entire alternate dimension of antimatter. You don't really imagine a herd of Giratina migrating for the winter. The lore treats them less like animals and more like fundamental laws wearing a body. One theory that makes all of this a lot less messy is to think of some legendaries as avatars, or manifestations. Maybe every Zapdos you see is just the storm-given form. Maybe each regional guardian is one mask worn by a bigger concept that exists everywhere. And that explains how you can have multiple appearances, events, and even conflicting stories without actually breaking the universe. You're not catching the one true idea of time. You're catching Dialga's current projection into reality. So you end up with this layered world. Mechanical rarity, 1 per save. Narrative uniqueness, 1 per myth. And then this almost mythic symbolism, where they're closer to ideas than individuals. And those 3 systems do not always line up. And when they don't, the games just shrug and move on. For now, though, keep that avatar idea in your head, because the next step is asking, if even the gods can be mass-produced or reissued as events, what does that say about all the other supposedly sacred, one-time-only moments in this series? So if the gods can be patched in like DLC, I want to talk about the moment the lore itself basically admits it's using metaphors. That's Arceus and its so-called thousand arms. In the Sinnoh myths, Arceus shapes the world with its thousand arms, which sounds epic. Until you look at the model, and it very clearly has 0 arms. Not even one. Just a weird wheel ring thing and some hooves. What's interesting about this is that Game Freak could have quietly dropped that line later, but they didn't. They kept repeating it in books, in dialogue, even in Legends, Arceus-era material. So either there's a secret horror form where it sprouts a bunch of limbs off-screen, or the games are begging you to read this as symbolic. One theory is that the arms are its creations. Dialga, Palkia, Giratina, the Lake Trio, maybe even the concept of time and space themselves reaching out like limbs to shape the universe. Another theory says the arms are its plates, and by extension the types. 18 plates, 18 fundamental forces, all extensions of the same origin. When Arceus changes type, it's not putting on armor, it's swapping which arm it's using to touch the world. It's worth mentioning that this lines up eerily well with how we talk about game systems. Types, stats, move categories. They're the invisible arms the designers used when they created the battle mechanics in the first place. And then there's the really meta reading. The thousand arms are the developer's hands. All the artists, programmers, writers, and debuggers reaching into this little cartridge universe and rearranging reality. The myth says Arceus shaped everything. The credits roll says, actually, so did about 200 people in Tokyo. Once you see it that way, the line stops being bad biology and starts feeling like a developer in the writing room, winking straight at you. You see the same thing with the unknown. In-world, they're these spooky alphabet Pokemon that warp reality when they gather. Out-of-world, they're literally the alphabet the devs use to spell hidden messages on walls and event maps. Language and existence are fused together. If the unknown spell it, it becomes real. That's just game text. That's the engine reading symbols and turning them into the world you walk around in. So a lot of these abstract details don't feel like creature lore anymore. They feel like fingerprints, little smudges where the act of game creation bleeds through the mythology. Arceus's arms, unknown sentences, even the way the distortion world bends geometry like someone grabbed the map in a level editor and started pulling. For now, though, hold on to that idea of unfinished arms and living letters, because the next layer down is where it gets really strange. The maps, glitches, and voids where you can literally walk into the parts of the universe that were never meant to exist and see what the thousand arms left behind. And speaking of walking into places you were never meant to exist in, I want to talk about something way more low-tech than the distortion world, but honestly just as weird. That stupid little truck by the SS Anne. If you grew up with red and blue, you know the one. Off to the right of the harbor, on this tiny patch of land you're never supposed to reach in normal play, there's just a truck. No driver, no dialogue, no explanation. It doesn't move, it doesn't do anything. But for an entire generation of kids, that ordinary sprite might as well have been the Ark of the Covenant. The theory was always the same. Mew is under the truck. Use strength on it. Use cut 300 times. Use strength while holding a specific item at a specific time of day that the game doesn't even track. What's interesting about this is that none of that is in the code. There is no hidden event. It's just a prop. But the fact that it was detailed, out of the way, and totally unused convinced people it had to be important. And this wasn't just one school making stuff up. This rumor survived years. It hopped from playgrounds to early message boards to magazines that would kind of wink and nudge about mysterious objects near the SS. And strategy guides mentioned the truck as if it were some profound piece of world building instead of a leftover tile the developers forgot to delete. The universe of Kanto had this one weird object that refused to explain itself, so the fandom happily did it for them. It's worth mentioning this didn't happen in a vacuum. Kanto is full of little dead ends that feel like they should be something. Locked doors in vermilion and saffron that never open. That one house in Celadon where nobody ever shows up. NPCs who say a single strange line exactly once and never elaborate. Items like the Pokédoll or the lift key that feel like they should unlock some secret if you use them in just the right place, at just the right time. After a while, the pattern trains you. You start to believe that there's always a hidden flag, a secret mechanic. It's in a late-night event waiting if you just press A on every tile. Even when the truth is boring, just unused data, just a decorative door, your brain insists there's a legendary behind it. The world feels deeper than the cartridge actually is, because the gaps are doing as much work as the lore that's explicitly written. And honestly, that's part of the magic. The games quietly created this expectation that every empty corner might hide a glitch city, or a secret boss, or a Mew under a truck, whether or not Arceus or the programmers ever put one there. Please let me know in the comments down below if your school had its own ridiculous truck ritual. I would love to hear them. For now, though, keep that feeling of there has to be something here. Because next, we're going into the places where there actually was. And the game only barely held together when you found them. And sometimes, the game kind of admits there's something here, but then hands that information to the weirdest possible messenger, the NPC who clearly knows too much, or somehow knows nothing at all. I want to talk about those people. The ones who casually reference entire disasters, facilities, or characters that simply do not exist on your cartridge, as if you skipped an episode of the show by accident. In Ruby and Sapphire, you have scientists in the Weather Institute alluding to past storms and experiments that supposedly happened before you arrived, but you never see any of it. In Gold and Silver, you get mentions of the old radio tower takeover and the burned brass tower, like they're common knowledge, but the actual events are sealed in the past, off-screen, in a version of the world you never get to visit in real time. What's interesting about this is how often it feels like you've walked into the middle of a conversation the universe was already having. There's that NPC in Canalave Library, reading about Sinnoh myths, who just drops lines about a Pokemon that created the universe and then goes back to their book. Like they didn't just summarize the Arceus creation myth in one sentence. There are workers in places like the power plant, or Silphco, who talk about projects being shut down, or machines that went too far, and you will never, ever see those machines. It's like the world is constantly cleaning up after a disaster you arrived slightly too late to witness. Then you have the characters who feel like they were built for something bigger, and then demoted to guy on Route 12, a random gym trainer with a unique backstory about training under some master you never meet. A scientist in a lab who hints at earlier test subjects that don't appear anywhere in the Pokédex. Ruby and Sapphire even have fully coded trainer classes and battle messages for opponents you never fight. It's worth mentioning that this isn't fan theory. This is in the data. The roles exist. The people just don't show up. On the other side, you get the NPCs who are weirdly aware they're in a game. The guy in early gens who tells you to save often. The tutorial NPCs who talk about pressing specific buttons as if that's just a normal part of the physics of this world. There's a fisherman in some games who brags about his encounter rate, which sounds less like lore and more like he's been reading the code. These little fourth wall fractures blur the line between player and character. Who exactly are they talking to? You, the child with a Game Boy? Or some in-universe audience that also understands menu navigation? All of this stacks with those empty houses and unused trainer classes we talked about. Together, they make the regions feel like sets that were built larger than the camera frame. You see just enough to know more exists. Closed facilities, forgotten experiments, missing mentors. But the doors stay locked. The disasters stay in the past. And the NPCs just keep dropping hints. Please let me know in the comments down below if you have your own favorite NPC who knows too much moments. I would love to hear them. For now, though, keep these half-finished people in mind, because next we're going to look at the places where the game itself starts to fall apart, and the world behind the curtain finally leaks through. And once you start seeing the seams like that, there's a really obvious question that comes up. If we were never meant to meet these broken NPCs, walk on these invisible maps, or pick up these mystery items, why are they still in the game at all? I want to talk about the boring answer first, because it actually makes everything else way more interesting. Game Freak was working with tiny cartridges and very strict memory budgets. By the time a map, a trainer, or an item was fully wired into that little universe, ripping it out late in development was like doing surgery on a Jenga tower. You could do it, but you were very likely to knock something else over in the process. So what's interesting about this is that, from a programmer's perspective, the safest move was usually not to delete anything. It was to quietly cut the doors, remove the warps, and just strand that content in the void where players wouldn't normally reach it. The unused Ruby and Sapphire trainer classes, the weird beta maps in Gold and Silver, all of those exist because it was faster and less risky to disable access than to reorganize the whole memory layout and pray the game didn't implode. It's worth mentioning that cartridges don't really like change once everything's packed in. In Gold and Silver, Kanto is literally built over compressed data from red and green, which is why so many routes feel shrunk and incomplete. If you start shuffling that data around to delete things, you risk breaking encounter tables, corrupting saves, or summoning your very own missing no by accident. And as funny as that is for us now, that was a nightmare scenario for a team trying to ship a game on time. But I don't think the explanation is just technical limitations. And we're done. These games were created by people, and people get attached to their work. Imagine spending months building a route or scripting a little story, only for someone to say, "This doesn't fit, cut it." Are you really going to erase every trace of it from the cartridge? Or are you going to comment out the entrance and tell yourself you might reuse it later? In a weird way, that's where the lore gets emotional. Those ghost maps and half-finished trainers feel like fossils of alternate timelines, branches of the Pokemon universe that almost got to exist. And because they stayed on the cartridge, they unintentionally created a second game layered under the first, an archaeology project for data miners, glitch hunters, and the kid who decided to walk up and down Cinnabar Island until reality broke. So now each cartridge becomes this layered artifact. The game you played on the surface, and the haunted underworld of abandoned designs underneath. And the real twist is that sometimes, when the code fails just right, those two layers touch. In the next section, I want to talk about what happens when the ghosts stop staying in their corners, and the game starts showing you places it was never supposed to show anyone. And that's where I want to pause and hand the flashlight over to you for a second. Because for all the data mining, for all the fan wikis and spreadsheets and frame-perfect glitch tutorials, every single person who grew up with Pokemon still has at least one moment the game never really explained. Not a big Arceus-level creation myth, not a clear bug, just something that felt wrong in the world for a second. A room that was too empty. An NPC that said something once and never again. A door that stayed locked your entire childhood and lived rent-free in your brain. I want to talk about those. Think back for a moment. Was there an empty house in your game that you kept checking, convinced that at a certain time or after a certain badge, someone would finally move in? Did you have that one weird NPC who mentioned a place you never found or a Pokemon that didn't seem to exist anywhere on your map? Maybe it was a rumor on the playground about a secret room under the SS Anne, or a friend of a friend who swore their cousin unlocked a hidden path in Lavender Town if you waited there at midnight. What's interesting about this is that half the time, these stories weren't even about real mechanics. They were about the gaps. The truck by the SS Anne, the unreachable bits of Kanto in gold and silver that felt like someone had literally carved pieces out of your old world and left the edges showing. The kid who insisted missing no could evolve if you did the steps in the perfect order. None of that is in the official lore, but it still shaped how the universe felt. So I'm genuinely curious. What did you see that the game never explained? Not just, I found a glitch once, but the stuff that became personal folklore. The cursed cartridge you were scared to save on. The copy of Ruby, where you were sure the weather changed at the wrong times. That one time your friend claimed they saw a ghost in the old chateau, before anyone knew what the old chateau even was. If you have stories like that, please let me know in the comments down below, because I would love to hear them. It's worth mentioning that even now, decades in, with people tearing these games apart down to individual bytes, there are still edge cases and regional myths that only exist because someone remembers them. A mistranslated line in your language version. A rumor that only circulated at your school. A theory your older sibling invented about why no adults seem to remember the Kalos War. For now, though, hold on to those memories, because later in the video I'm going to dig into a few obscure secrets that feel almost designed to feed this kind of communal storytelling. The kind of things that make you wonder whether the developers were quietly watching the playground and deciding to play along. For now, though, let's gently close the comments tab in our brains and set all those modern theories on the shelf. We're going to roll the clock all the way back to the beginning, to the cartridges, where so many of these patterns were first created, even if the games themselves never really explained what they were doing. Because red, green, and blue aren't just the first games. They're basically public prototypes that accidentally shipped to millions of kids. The code is messy. The world is stitched together out of weird little shortcuts. And what's interesting about this is that those shortcuts never fully went away. Bits of that skeleton keep poking through in later generations, like how gold and silver literally compress and repurpose red and green's Kanto data. Which is why post-game Kanto feels oddly shrunk, hollow, like you're walking through a dream of a place that used to exist in full. I want to talk about that feeling for a second. That sense that underneath the bright colors and simple roots, there's a half-finished version of the universe still humming away. In the early games, you can actually see it. Unused maps sitting just off the edge of the world. Test rooms. Leftover doors that don't go anywhere. There are trainers fully coded in Ruby and Sapphire that you never legitimately fight. Items in red and blue that do absolutely nothing. And yet they're still there, quietly taking up space like ghosts of features that never got their birth moment. And of course, sometimes that skeleton forces its way into the spotlight. Missing No isn't just a funny glitch Pokemon. It's the game's memory, actively falling apart in front of you. The encounter table points to data that doesn't really exist. The cartridge shrugs, and you get a scrambled creature that can duplicate your items and corrupt your Hall of Fame. That's not polished design. That's a prototype screaming through the cracks. In this next stretch, we're going to slow down and basically page through that hidden design document together. Unused maps, beta sprites that look a little too uncanny, strange items with no real purpose, and those early glitch spaces that feel like rough drafts of the later voids and ghost NPCs. The pace is still going to stay soft and descriptive, like we're quietly wandering through an empty office at night, opening drawers the developers forgot to lock. It's worth mentioning that once you see how rough and experimental these first games were, later mysteries start to feel different. The voids in Sinnoh, the ghost girl in Unova, the old chateau figures that appear without explanation. Suddenly they read less like random creepiness and more like an evolving design language. The universe of Pokemon has always been held together with tape and leftover data. The series just got better at hiding it. So, as we move into these early game secrets, keep that in mind. We're not just hunting spooky glitches for nostalgia. We're watching the rules of this strange little world being written in real time, one unfinished map at a time. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the maps that were built, finished, and then quietly shoved into the void. I want to talk about the places that technically exist in your cartridge, but the game pretends they were never created at all. When data miners cracked open Red and Green's code, they didn't just find stray tiles or half-finished rooms. They found entire beta towns and test areas sitting just off stage, like a cardboard city the actors never walk into. What's interesting about this is how normal they look at first glance. Soon early versions of towns use the same Kanto tiles you know, but the layouts are too simple, too boxy, like a draft of Palette or Viridian that never got a second pass. One of the most famous examples is the so-called Safari Zone Beta, an unused map that reuses Safari tiles, but doesn't match the final layout at all. It feels like an earlier idea for how that whole corner of the world was going to be structured. There are also test houses, with totally generic interiors, beds and tables thrown down with no care for story, sometimes even a healing machine jammed in a living room. That tile choice screams functional checkpoint more than someone lives here, which tells you these weren't meant for lore, just for the developers to sprint through and test events. And here's where it starts to feel eerie. Most of these maps have no scripts, no NPCs. You walk in using glitches or hacks because the game never lets you visit normally, and nothing happens. No music change, no dialogue, no events. Just familiar Pokemon art arranged in a configuration your childhood brain never saw. It's like waking up in a dream version of Viridian City, where everyone moved out 5 minutes before you arrived. It's worth mentioning, this isn't just a Gen 1 quirk. Gold and Silver literally compress Kanto into a smaller, repurposed version of the Red/Green data. which is why so many routes feel weirdly short or incomplete. In a way, you're walking on the grave of the previous game's map structure. Sinnoh goes the opposite direction with those void floating event rooms. Stark, single-platform spaces for Arceus or Darkrai that hang in black nothingness. Pure function with almost no world building. More recent titles hide full-on debug maps, grids of warps, and NPCs labeled for testing, never meant to be seen unless you tear the universe open. So when you step into these places through a glitch, it doesn't feel like cheating. It feels like you've slipped backstage in the middle of the performance. The world is still there, but the illusion is gone. You see how quickly the stage was hammered together, how many doors lead nowhere, how many rooms were built for actors that never showed up, and if entire towns can vanish like that, what else did they erase, or worse, leave half alive in the code, waiting for someone to stumble in? For now, though, keep that feeling in mind, because the next set of secrets doesn't just leave you in empty rooms. It starts actively breaking the rules of reality itself. If ghost towns are creepy, ghost items are somehow worse because they look important. They sound important. And then, nothing happens. You're holding evidence that the world was supposed to be different, and the game just stares back at you in silence. I want to talk about all those mystery items and key objects that technically exist in the code, but don't actually do anything in normal play. In red and blue, there are entire entries in the item table you can only see with cheating devices. Things like the Teru-sama placeholder item, or weird, glitched names that clearly aren't meant for human eyes. You can scroll to them, you can select them, but when you try to use them, the universe just shrugs. No text, no event. Just the feeling that you've rung a doorbell on a house that was never built. What's interesting about this is that the pattern doesn't go away as the series gets more polished. It just gets more specific. By gold and silver, you start seeing unused key items that look like they were created for real features. Early builds and internal data hint at things like extra key items for events that never happened, or tools that don't have any matching mechanic. The items exist. The descriptions sometimes exist, but the rest of the script is missing. It's like walking backstage and finding props for a play that never opened. Then you get to later generations and it gets almost poetic. In the Game Boy Advance and DS era, you have unused tickets and passes that don't correspond to any legitimate location. We had the Eon ticket, Mystic ticket, Old Sea map, all tied to real events. Sure. But sitting alongside them in the data are other planned key items and half-finished descriptions that point to islands and encounters that just never arrive. Sometimes the text literally talks about boarding a ship to a place that does not exist anywhere in the finished map. Why name the port if you're going to delete the harbor? It's worth mentioning that a few of these ghost ideas eventually get reincarnated. A scrapped ticket in one generation looks suspiciously similar to a real event item 2 generations later. A mysterious tool with no function suddenly reappears as part of a new mechanic, like the way various stones and orbs keep coming back whenever the lore needs a new way to bend time, space, or evolution. The developers clearly have a long memory. The universe forgets, but the codebase does not. Here's the pattern interrupt. Imagine every useless item as an artifact from an alternate timeline. There's a version of your cartridge where that ticket did take you somewhere, where that odd machine in your bag actually turned on, where an entire side story about some legendary Pokemon played out and then was quietly erased. These items are the fossils of those erased branches, preserved as inert data. They don't trigger cutscenes, They don't reshape the world, but they prove that other versions of this world almost existed. So the next time you see a hacked-in key item that does nothing, remember, you're not just breaking the game. You're brushing against one of its abandoned futures. And from here, we move from dead objects to something stranger. Places where the game doesn't just leave things unused. It lets reality itself start to fall apart in front of you. And nowhere does reality feel more unstable than in Ruby and Sapphire, where the game quietly ships with opponents who technically exist, but you can never actually meet them. These aren't half-finished ideas or broken sprites. These are fully created people, with names, classes, and battle quotes sealed away like they're in witness protection. I want to talk about Hoenn's invisible trainers. Inside the data, Ruby and Sapphire have trainer classes that never show up in a normal run. Things like the Aroma Lady variant that never gets used, or the Hex Maniac style occultist with full win and loss quotes, but no place on any route. There's even a Battle Girl entry with dialogue and a registered class number that the game just never calls. The universe of Hoenn literally knows who these people are. It just never lets you shake their hand. What's interesting about this is how complete they are. They have intro messages, like a scrapped gentleman who was apparently going to challenge you with a smug. A true trainer always battles with grace, and lost lines that sound like they were written for specific facilities. One unused trainer talks about warming up for the real challenge ahead, which sure feels like they were meant for some kind of extra battle tower, dojo, or side dungeon that got cut when the clock ran out. There are also unused double battle setups with paired dialogue that implies whole little stories. You get lines from partners arguing about strategy or bragging that they never lose when they fight together, despite the fact that in the actual story, they never fight together at all. It's like reading a script for a deleted scene after watching the movie and realizing there was supposed to be an entire subplot wedged between two gym badges. It's worth mentioning that these ghosts probably point to a busier Hoenn. You can imagine extra routes off the coastline, a scrapped volcano side path, or an early version of a battle facility where these trainers would have lived. One theory is that some of them were prototypes for Emerald's expanded battle frontier, left behind when the team decided to move those ideas to a third version instead of cramming them into the original release. Does that mean your cartridge is basically carrying around a rehearsal for a game that only half exists? The uncanniest part is reading battle quotes from characters who, officially, never had a berth in the story. No house, no overworld sprite, no role in the lore. Just floating lines like, "I'll remember this battle for a long time," spoken by someone the player can never meet. For now, though, they're trapped in the code, forever ready to send out a Pokemon they will never actually send. And this isn't unique to Hoenn. Every generation leaves behind its own unused trainers and dialogue, slowly building a kind of shadow version of the game that only exists in the data. So if we've got invisible people, what happens when the game doesn't just hide them, but lets the entire map start collapsing into places you were absolutely not meant to stand? When the map starts falling apart, the game stops feeling like a cute adventure and starts feeling like you've cracked open the physics of this little universe. And under all the voids and missing no's, there's an even weirder truth. The world is being run by a secret rulebook. The game never shows you. I want to talk about encounter slots, because this is where that hidden rulebook really shows through. Every route, every cave, every patch of grass has a little table the game quietly consults. 10 slots, 12 slots, whatever the generation uses, each one pointing to a specific Pokemon a level range, and a percentage. You think you're just walking through Route 1, but underneath, the game is rolling a number, and then checking a chart, like a bored accountant deciding whether you get Pidgey or Rattata today. What's interesting about this is what happens when that chart breaks. In red and blue, glitches like the old man glitch can make the encounter table point to index numbers that don't actually have proper data. The game still tries to obey the rules, so it reaches into uninitialized memory and treats whatever garbage it finds as a Pokemon. That's how you get Missing No. Not a demon, not a cursed entity, just the encounter table reading from a slot that was never meant to exist. It's worth mentioning that a lot of magic items are just fancy ways of editing which lines of that table the game is allowed to read. Sweet Scent forces an immediate encounter, but it still uses the same slots as the grass around you. Repels don't stop encounters. They just say, ignore any slot that rolls a Pokemon under this level. Time of Day in later games doesn't create new species from nowhere. It swaps parts of the table in and out. Morning might weight the early slots toward birds. Night might quietly replace them with ghosts or bats. The game never explains this, but the world you experience is literally being created by those silent percentage tweaks. And battles have their own fine print. When two Pokemon have the exact same speed, the game doesn't shrug. It flips a hidden coin every turn to decide who actually moves first. Certain status conditions stack in strange ways. Paralysis cuts your speed. Trick Room flips turn order based on that reduced speed, and suddenly your slow, paralyzed Mon is moving before a legendary. Burn and Poison tick at precise fractions of max HP. Weather damage checks happen in a specific order. And if two Pokemon faint from residual damage at the end of a turn, there's a strict priority list for who the game considers to have lost first. All of this is the microscopic lore of the universe. Not myths about Arceus, but the physics that actually decide who appears, who moves, and who survives. When you brush against the edges, run into a glitch, see a level 100 wild Pokemon, or watch the turn order behave in a way that feels impossible, it's not the game breaking. It's the hidden system poking through the story. For now, though, keep that idea in the back of your mind, because if the rules of encounters and battles can quietly warp reality, what happens when the game starts rewriting entire locations, or even time itself? And once you hit the later generations, that feeling that the game is quietly rewriting reality doesn't go away. It just gets architectural. Whole buildings, ruins, and dimensions start acting like glitches with better interior design. I want to talk about Unova first, because Gen 5 looks like a clean reboot on the surface, but its world is full of places that feel like they were created for a horror game and then never fully explained. The Strange House on Route 15 is basically a haunted memory palace. Furniture moves when you're not looking. A ghost girl keeps appearing and disappearing. And the item at the end is a lunar wing, tying it to Cresselia and Darkrai without ever spelling out what actually happened there. You get fragments, implication, and then the game just sends you back outside like, anyway, enjoy your badge quest. What's interesting about this is that Unova doubles down with the Abyssal Ruins. You dive into this underwater maze with a limited number of steps, being surrounded by eerie music and crumbling walls covered in ancient text you can't read. You need external translations or fan work to even parse it. And even then, it's just this half-decayed story about a king, a great disaster, and a civilization obsessed with a certain Pokemon. There's no quest marker, no cutscene payoff. It's like walking through the footnotes of a history book that the main game forgot to include. Then Kalos shows up and says, "You like that? cool, here's a ghost in the middle of your fancy Paris region. In Lumiose City, you step into an office building. The lights flicker, and a girl literally floats toward you, says, "No, you're not the one," and vanishes. No battle, no follow-up, no entry in the story recap. It's worth mentioning that this is in the same region where a giant war machine wiped out thousands of Pokemon, and somehow, the thing that unsettles people most is the random office ghost with no closure. Alola goes even further and just opens a door to ultraspace. Suddenly you're in a glowing, empty dimension where gravity and sound feel wrong, chasing ultra beasts that look like they wandered in from a completely different universe. Nihilego is a glass jellyfish parasite. Buzzwole is a meme of muscular insects made real, and Blacephalon is a clown firework that removes its own head. They technically count as Pokemon, but everything about their design screams intruder, rather than natural creature that evolved over time. By the time we reach Galar and Paldea, the games are bigger, shinier, and more open, but the half-explained myths and ruins keep stacking up. Galar has the Darkest Day murals, the hero with maybe one sword, maybe two, maybe a dog, and an entire history of Dynamax energy. That's basically one long environmental disaster. The region pretends is fine. Paldea quietly litters its map with ancient research stations, the Area Zero Crater, and Paradox Pokemon, whose existence breaks every previous theory about how this world even works. For now, though, the important thing is that even as the series becomes more polished, the developers keep carving out these quiet, unsettling corners that feel like they belong to a different genre entirely. And if the official games are willing to get this weird in plain sight, you can probably imagine how strange things get when we start digging into the myths, fan theories, and cut content that try to stitch all of this together into one timeline. So here's where things get a little weird in a different way. Because once you start poking at glitches and hidden data, you kind of have to decide what you think you're even looking at. Is this part of the Pokemon world, or are we just staring straight at the wiring behind the walls? I want to talk about two main lenses you can use, and both of them are totally valid. The first one is the very boring, very programmer-brained view, glitches as pure accidents. In this lens, Missing No isn't a ghost or a forgotten deity. It's just what happens when the encounter table in red and blue points to an index number that doesn't have a real Pokemon attached. The game panics, grabs whatever garbage data is nearby, and boom, you've created a new Pokemon that was never meant to exist. It's worth mentioning that from this angle, the void, the walk-through walls stuff, all those glitch maps are just the game reading uninitialized memory and treating it like a normal route. From that perspective, none of it says anything about the in-universe lore. The old man glitch isn't a secret portal. It's a side effect of how the game stores your name and memory to handle the catching tutorial. The void in later games isn't a cosmic nothingness. It's what happens when you go outside the boundaries the developers actually drew. This is the lens speedrunners and ROM hackers live in, where everything is tables and flags and leftover data from when Kanto was first created. But then there's the second lens, and this is where things get fun. You can treat glitches as these liminal, half-real spaces that sit between canon and imagination. They're not officially part of the story, but they feel like they belong thematically, especially in a series that's already obsessed with memory, decay, and the limits of what humans in this universe actually understand. When you step into the void in Diamond and Pearl, it's very easy to read it as a cousin to the distortion world, a place the camera was never meant to show you, where the rules of space quietly fall apart. Missing No, in that reading, becomes less of a bug and more of a symbol. It's the game's memory, literally breaking down, your save file fraying at the edges. Of course, that inspired creepypasta. Stories where catching it corrupts reality, or summons some forgotten Arceus tier being that predates the universe. The same thing happens with ghost NPCs like the old chateau girl who silently appears and disappears, or that butler who glides past you without explanation. Technically, we can explain them. But what's interesting about this is that they still feel like hauntings, like echoes of people who used to exist in a version of the world we never got to see. Most fans, whether they realize it or not, bounce between these two views all the time. You watch a breakdown of how the old man glitch works. Then 2 minutes later, you're reading a theory about a cursed cartridge and fully enjoying it. You can know that the Kanto in gold and silver is compressed map data from red and green, and still feel a little melancholy that you're walking through a shrunken memory of a region's birth. The code and the myth sit right on top of each other, and especially as you're drifting towards sleep, I actually think that's the best way to hold these glitches in your mind, as both a bug report and a bedtime story. On one level, you're just seeing pointers and bytes misbehaving. On another, you're wandering into the negative space of the Pokemon universe, the places that technically don't exist, but still feel emotionally real. For now, though, keep both lenses handy, because next I want to talk about how fans take these cracks in the code and build entire urban legends and timelines out of them. And here's the thing I want to talk about next. For a lot of us, those cracks in the code were our first proof that games were bigger on the inside. When you first ran into something like Missing Gnome as a kid, you weren't thinking about memory addresses or encounter tables. You were just staring at this scrambled, half-born Pokemon and going, wait, the cartridge can do that. The world stopped feeling like a toy and started feeling like a place that could misbehave. What's interesting about this is how tied it is to the age we first saw it. Back then, the Game Boy might as well have been a little Arceus in plastic form. You pressed A, and entire universes appeared. So when you walked into a void or saw your Hall of Fame glitch out, it didn't read as buggy software. It read as the universe slipping. The manual never mentioned the old man glitch, or why surfing along Cinnabar could tear open reality. So discovering it felt like you'd stepped off the map into secret lore the adults didn't even know existed. It's worth mentioning that the games quietly encouraged this feeling. In gold and silver, Kanto is literally this compressed, half-remembered version of red and green, rebuilt over repurposed data. Routes are shorter, buildings are missing. Whole areas feel like they've been lost to time. As a kid, that just felt eerie and sad, like visiting your childhood hometown and realizing the playground got paved over. As an adult, you can read the code and see why it's like that. But the emotional imprint doesn't go away. Now, when we revisit these mysteries, the unknown becomes a puzzle instead of a threat. You can look up exactly how Missing Numtion was created, or why certain ghost NPCs in the old chateau don't appear on the normal NPC list, and there's something surprisingly soothing about that. The monster under the bed turns out to be a bunch of pointers and flags, but your memory of being just a little scared still exists. You get both layers at once: the comfort of understanding and the comfort of remembering what it felt like not to. In a weird way, the broken edges of Pokemon mirror our own nostalgia. Our memories of these games are glitchy. We half remember beta maps that never existed, trainers we swear we fought, items we thought did something important, but were just leftovers. The cartridges have unused data. Our brains have unused scenes. Neither is perfectly accurate, but both are full of stories. So lying in bed, letting these half-true, half-glitched legends wash over you, is kind of like booting up that old save file one more time. You're in that liminal space between knowing and wondering, between this is just how the engine handles memory, and but what if there's more? And if you have your own broken cartridge stories, well, please let me know in the comments down below, because I would love to hear them. For now, though, we've only talked about the accidents. Next, I want to talk about what happens when fans decide those accidents are canon and start rewriting the entire history of the Pokemon universe. And that's where this gets bigger than just haunted cartridges and funny glitches. Because once you zoom out, you start to see that the entire Pokemon universe is basically built like those broken saves, layer on top of layer, story on top of story, with the old stuff still quietly humming underneath. I want to talk about how that starts all the way at the top, with Arceus. Officially, we're told this god Pokemon hatched from an egg in a void, created time and space, brought the universe into being, and then everything else followed. Very clean, very mythological. But right under that polished creation story, you have fossils of ancient Pokemon that don't fit anywhere, ruined temples to things that aren't Arceus, and Pokedex entries that casually imply older disasters and older gods. Why does Sinnoh worship Arceus, while other regions barely mention it? Why do some entries talk like the world has been reset more than once? The neat birth myth is written over a much messier, possibly older world that still seems to exist in the background. And the games themselves are built the same way. It's worth mentioning that Johto's Kanto in Gold and Silver isn't just a cute revisit. It's literally a compressed, repurposed version of the original Kanto data from Red and Green. Routes are shortened, buildings vanish, caves get sealed off, because they're basically shoving an older game into a new cartridge and carving pieces out. Sinnoh hides a literal void in its code, a big empty negative space where unused maps and strange test rooms sit beside places you actually visit. Across generations, we see unused safari zones, scrapped islands, half-finished interiors, entire ghost regions the player never sees, but the cartridge still remembers. Underneath that, there's another layer, the invisible math. Hidden mechanics like IVs, encounter tables, and friendship values quietly decide which Pokemon you meet, how strong they are, and how your team actually behaves. The game never tells you this exists, just like it never really explains why ghosts obey certain rules or why legendaries keep reawakening every few centuries. What's interesting about this is that the lore and the code are doing the same thing. Unspoken systems shaping the visible world, while pretending everything is simple and straightforward. So is that a flaw? Honestly, I think this layered construction is the whole point. Pokemon may be one of the most beloved franchises of all time, but it's also a series that obviously did not put a lot of thought into making its lore perfectly consistent. Instead, every generation just writes a new story over the old one, like a palimpsest, but never fully erases what was there before. You still feel the outline of Kanto under Johto, the shadow of ancient catastrophes under Kalos, the echo of earlier Arceus theories under Hisui. For now, though, I want you to imagine your favorite region not as a flat map, but as a stack of worlds. On top, you have the version you played. Under that, the beta maps and glitch spaces. Under that, the myths, the failed ideas, the memories you misremember. All of them occupying the same cartridge at the same time. And if you have your own theory about what's hiding in those lower layers, please let me know in the comments down below, because I would love to hear them. And the annoying, beautiful thing about this stack of worlds is that even after everything we've talked about, there's still a whole layer we just didn't have time to touch. Pokemon may be one of the most beloved franchises of all time, but it's also a series that keeps shoving bizarre secrets into the couch cushions of its own code. I want to talk about all of it, but we'd be here until Arceus finally clocks out and lets someone else manage the universe. Like, we barely mentioned the Azure Flute and the Hall of Origin event in Sinnoh, where you were originally supposed to literally climb a staircase into the sky to meet God. That's not subtle. That's just, yeah, your cartridge has a backdoor to heaven, and then Game Freak quietly locks it away and pretends it never existed. It's worth mentioning that this same pattern shows up everywhere. There are internal debug menus in early builds that let developers warp around the world, spawn any Pokemon, or toggle flags that don't even exist in the final game. Fans have dug up footage and leftover code for these, but the average player never sees that version of the world. It's like there's a secret control room behind every route that you're never invited into. Then you've got the truly obscure regional distributions. Event-only Arceus in Japan that could trigger extra scenes. Items handed out at one mall on one weekend that unlocked weird mythical encounters. Mystery gifts tied to long-dead websites. Entire branches of lore basically lived and died in a parking lot somewhere in 2009. If you weren't there in person, that part of the universe might as well not exist. On top of that, there's an endless sea of fan-discovered glitches and edge cases that are just too technical to unpack here. Arbitrary code execution in Gen 1, turning your save file into a programmable computer. Void walking in Diamond and Pearl to slip out of bounds and wander through half-finished maps. Even modern games still have strange breeding and battle interactions that only show up if you're willing to break the rules of space and time in very specific ways. And every generation, data miners crack open the newest release and immediately find the ghosts of futures that never happened. Unused moves with no animations, abilities with no users, models for forms that never appear, half-implemented items that quietly sit in the data. What's interesting about this is that it means the world you played is basically the public draft of something bigger that was created and then trimmed down. For now, though, think of all these missing pieces as proof that no single video can map this universe completely. If you're still awake, you can absolutely go hunt down Azure Flute footage, debug menu screenshots, or lists of unused moves later. And if you're drifting off, you can just let the idea that there's always one more secret out there carry you the rest of the way to sleep. And that idea has been around way longer than YouTube thumbnails and datamine threads. Before we had people ripping apart the code of a new game 10 minutes after release, we had the playground. We had that one kid who swore his uncle at Nintendo told him you could get Mew by using strength on the truck, or that pressing A at exactly the right time would make your Pokeball never fail. I want to talk about how wild that shift actually is. Back then, we were basically doing folklore speedruns. Somebody misread a magazine, someone else misremembered a line of dialogue, and suddenly there was a whole theory about a secret evolution for Dragonite if you beat the Elite Four 100 times without healing. No screenshots, no proof. Just vibes, recess, and an absolutely unearned level of confidence. Now, the moment a new Pokemon game comes out, people crack it open like a Lugia egg. Data miners pull out unused items, half-finished maps, and entire forms that don't even exist in the final story. Instead of your friend claiming there's a hidden cave behind the Pokemon League, you get a spreadsheet showing the exact coordinates of an unused room and the internal name the developers gave it. It's worth mentioning that this hasn't made things less mysterious. It's just made the mystery better documented. What's interesting about this is that the core impulse hasn't changed at all. We still want to believe the world of these games is deeper than what's on the surface. We still assume the cartridge, or the download, is hiding something from us. And if we all compare notes, we'll eventually crack it. The only difference is that instead of rumors about Pika-Blue, we have full-on research threads cataloging every glitch, every void space, every piece of lore text that doesn't quite line up with the rest of the universe. Those missing no encounters that used to be whispered about like a curse, now they're explained down to which part of memory the game is accidentally reading. Unused trainer classes in Ruby and Sapphire, ghost NPCs in the old chateau that don't follow normal rules, Kanto being literally compressed and rebuilt inside gold and silver's data so it feels like a dream of your old journey. These aren't myths anymore. They're documented phenomena, archived like fossils from an earlier version of the world that almost existed. But that hasn't killed the magic. It's just moved it. The wonder now lives in realizing how much thought, accident, and leftover debris went into building these regions in the first place. Instead of imagining Arceus secretly adding a new route while you sleep, you get to see the birth and decay of ideas inside the game's own code. And you're part of that. Whether you're here chasing nostalgia, poking at the technical side of how these games were created, or just letting a soothing voice walk you through the lore until you drift off, you're in the same tradition as those playground storytellers. You're quietly investigating. You're listening for one more detail that makes the whole world feel bigger. If you've got your own childhood rumors or modern discoveries, please let me know in the comments down below, because I would love to hear them before we dive even deeper into the stranger corners of this universe. And the reason those stories stick with you, even now, is that they quietly match how the real world works. In real life, nobody has the full Pokédex. There isn't one perfect book where you can look up everything that exists. There are rumors, there are urban legends, there are half-remembered histories your uncle swears are true, but absolutely cannot prove. I want to talk about how Pokemon accidentally leans into that. What's interesting about this universe is that it's not a clean, closed system, where every mystery gets a neat little answer. You have official myths about Arceus and the birth of time and space, sure, but then you also have wildly contradictory Pokédex entries that sound like they were written by different researchers who never compared notes. One scientist says a Pokemon dies if its flame goes out. Another casually mentions it living in the rain. Who's right? Maybe neither. Maybe that's the point. Because when the game tells you one thing in one region and quietly undermines it in another, it starts to feel less like a perfectly solved puzzle and more like an actual culture, with bad data and biased witnesses and spooky campfire stories. If every mechanic were explained, every origin nailed down, and every unused sprite or map scrubbed from the cartridge, the world would feel finished. And a finished world is kind of a dead world. Once you've solved it, why go back? Instead, these games are full of ghost data that hints at things just outside the frame. Deep in Ruby and Sapphire, there are fully coded trainer classes and battle messages for opponents you never meet in any normal playthrough. In Gold and Silver, the entire post-game Kanto is literally built on compressed red and green data, which is why the routes feel weirdly shrunk and incomplete, like you're walking through a faded memory of your own childhood save file. It's worth mentioning that this isn't just trivia. It makes Kanto feel like it has a history, like the region itself has aged. And then there are the glitches. Missing No isn't just a funny broken bird cube. It's a tiny window into how the game's memory falls apart when you ask it a question it doesn't know how to answer. The void spaces, the old man glitch, surfing along the edge of reality in Diamond and Pearl. These all quietly remind you that this universe was created by humans, with mistakes and deadlines and weird workarounds. That actually makes it feel more handcrafted, not less. A sterile game with no bugs, no cut content, no creepy old chateau ghosts that don't even appear in the normal NPC list. That would feel like a museum exhibit, not a place you live in. So the same things that look like flaws, bugs, cut maps, horror movie Pokedex lines about children getting dragged into the sea, are exactly what keep this lore alive in your head, even when you're just listening in the dark. They leave room for your own theory, your own what if. And if the world already feels this strange, just from the leftovers and mistakes, what happens when we dig into the secrets that were hidden on purpose? So let's slow down for a second and just walk back through everything we've wandered into tonight, like we're taking one last lap around a very broken, very cozy museum. Pokemon might be one of the most beloved franchises of all time, but it's also a series where your bedtime story starts with a god hatching from an egg in a void and somehow ends with your save file surfing along the edge of reality. We started at the beginning of the universe, with Arceus floating in that silent nothing. No map, no menu, just an egg in the dark that somehow created time, space, and all the rules that make this world exist. I want to talk about how strangely peaceful that is. The birth of everything as a single point in the void, before there were roots or trainers or even the idea of a Pokeball. From there, we watched the universe get crowded. Dialga and Palkia, stretching out time and space, Giratina shoved into its own distorted corner, and Sinnoh, sitting right on top of that cosmic fault line. When you clip out of bounds in those games and fall into endless black, it almost feels honest, like the distortion world is always just one tile away. Then we came back down to the ground, to regions that were clearly built on top of older ghosts. It's worth mentioning that Gold and Silver's Kanto is literally a compressed, shrunken version of your original journey. The old world folded up so the new cartridge could breathe. Towns are smaller, routes are clipped, and it feels like you're visiting a childhood home after someone knocked out a few walls. Along the way, we pass through places that never fully explain themselves. The old chateau, where a silent girl slides past the doorway without a sound or a text box. The Cinnabar Coast, where Missing No waits at the edge of the encounter table. A pile of leftover data pretending to be a Pokemon. The voids between maps, where the screen goes black, and the music keeps playing like nothing is wrong. What's interesting about this is that under all of that, there are invisible systems quietly pushing everything along. Friendship values ticking up with every step. IVs deciding your fate before you even press new game. Encounter tables shuffling behind the grass to decide who appears. You never see them, but they're there, like currents under a surface that looks calm and simple. Layer on top of that, the myths, the fan theory, the cut content, and finally your own memories. And the world starts to feel like a stack of translucent maps. Gods on top of stats, new regions on top of old data, horror movie Pokedex lines on top of cheerful battle themes. For now, though, if you're somehow still awake, I want you to imagine surfing along the edge of the map one last time, watching the tiles end and the void begin, and knowing that behind all of it is just more data and more stories waiting to glitch through. If you have your own favorite strange corner or broken memory from these games, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to hear them. So if you're still here, still kind of hovering between awake and asleep, that's totally fine. At this point, the lore is basically just white noise with Arceus shapes drifting through it, and honestly, that might be the ideal way to experience how this universe was created in the first place. It's like letting 1,000 half-finished Pokédex entries wash over you until they all blur into one long, strange bedtime story. If any of this actually stuck in your brain and didn't just dissolve into dream mush, I want to talk about your side of it for a second. For the few of you who are somehow still conscious, please let me know in the comments down below if you have a favorite hidden secret, glitch, or weird Pokédex theory. Think of it like adding your own little page to this ongoing archive of ghost data we've been quietly building together over time. Did you grow up with Missing No, corrupting your Hall of Fame? Or did you stumble into some empty house or locked door that felt way more important than the game ever admitted? What's interesting about this is that everyone seems to have one tiny moment where the world cracked a little. Maybe it was reading a creepy entry about a Pokemon that steals children at night, or realizing that the old chateau ghosts in Sinnoh can appear silently, with no explanation, and then never get mentioned again. Maybe it was learning, years later, that gold and silver literally compressed an entire version of Kanto and just kind of shoved it in the corner of the cartridge like an old save file. If you've got stories like that, I would love to hear them. And if you're too sleepy to type anything right now, that's fine. For now, though, you can just queue up more long-form Pokemon lore or analysis for future nights. Let this become your background ritual. You brush your teeth, you lie down, and you let some video about the birth of the universe, or unused trainer data, or scrapped maps slowly explain itself while you drift off. You don't even have to follow every detail. The point is that this familiar world keeps unfolding quietly in the background. It's worth mentioning, very softly, that if you do want more of this kind of calm deep dive, you can like the video or subscribe as a little signal to the algorithm that you want more sleepy nonsense about gods, glitches, and contradictions. You're not signing up for hype. You're just telling the machine, hey, more quiet weirdness about Pokemon, please. And the nice thing is, there will always be more. More ghost data buried in code, more myths that don't line up, more regions that pretend previous disasters didn't exist. As long as this series keeps trying to stitch a coherent history out of all these pieces, I'll be here to walk through it with you. Slowly, one strange secret at a time, until your eyes finally close. And the funny part is, even when you finally do close your eyes, the game doesn't really stop. Somewhere in your room there's a Game Boy, or a DS, or a Switch, just sitting on the bedside table. The screen's dimmed, the music's faded to that soft electronic hum, and your character is frozen mid-step on some quiet route, or standing in the middle of an empty house that you never bothered to decorate. I want to talk about that image for a second, because what's interesting about this is how much is crammed into that tiny sleeping rectangle. Inside that cartridge, that little piece of plastic and silicon, entire regions exist at once. There are the routes you know by heart. And then there are unused maps, ghost test rooms, glitch corridors, and scrap trainers that were created, then abandoned, but never fully erased. All of it is still there, even when you're brushing your teeth and pretending you're not going to stay up for one more encounter. If you could peel the label off the cart and look straight into the code, you'd find all the stuff the game politely never explains. Friendship values ticking up and down in the background. Invisible numbers deciding which Pokemon will be good forever from the moment of birth. Encounter tables that, if they point to the wrong place, suddenly spit out missing no, and tear a hole in the world. It's worth mentioning that half the haunted feeling of these games is just the side effect of very normal systems trying not to fall apart in real time. But your brain doesn't care about hex values. It remembers the feeling. The old chateau, where ghosts appear with no dialogue and no closure. That one locked house in a city you never get the key for. The post-game canto that feels smaller, like you're walking through a memory that's been compressed to save space. When you finally fall asleep, all of that lore just keeps looping quietly in the background, like a process your mind forgot to close. Pokemon may be this cozy childhood refuge, a universe of bright colors and friendly creatures, but it's also a labyrinth of half-finished ideas, discarded theories, and unsettling Pokédex entries that read like micro-horror stories. Both of those things exist in the same cartridge, at the same time. The game that tucked you in is the same game that hides void spaces off the edge of the map where the music cuts out and the screen goes black. So when you put the system down and the little power light blinks, nothing important actually ends. The worlds you visited are still there, patiently waiting at the exact frame you left them. Arceus is still out in its void. The glitches are still buzzing at the borders of the screen, and every unanswered question is still hanging in the air, right where you paused. For now, though, you can let it all go. Rest easy. The roots, the ghosts, the strange little secrets tucked into the corners of this series will still be there in the morning, exactly where you left them, waiting for you to wake up and press A.